Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. I'm going to be talking about research on bilingual children, but I can't claim to be one myself, so I apologize. My talk will be in English because I am sure your English is fine and my Spanish is not. Okay, so let's begin with, this could be put as a question: how is bilingual development different or not different from monolingual development? And before I start presenting my results, just think for a minute about what the possibilities are for an answer to this question. On the one hand, bilingual development, now I'm talking about simultaneous bilingual development. So think about a baby who is hearing two languages. What happens? One possibility is they learn two languages, same as they learn one. And there is a position in the world, probably more in the lay world, that babies are sponges. Children are sponges. You give them one language, two languages, three languages. It's magic. We don't know how they do it, but they acquire as many languages as you present to them, and without any consequence to each language. So that's one extreme possibility. Another extreme possibility, which most certainly is a belief that's held in some quarters, is that this is going to be horribly confusing. The baby isn't going to know which language is which, and they're going to be kind of stuck and not able to acquire either of the languages they're exposed to. So as you can imagine, the truth is somewhere in between, and the rest of the hour I'll be talking about the details of what my research suggests is that intermediate position of ways in which bilingual development is very much like monolingual development, but some ways in which it is not exactly the same. All right, so the source of the evidence that I'm going to present comes from a longitudinal study that I've been doing for quite a while now. I followed children who were children of Spanish-speaking immigrants in South Florida. The criterion for being in the study was one or both parents had to be born in a Spanish-speaking country, and they had to use Spanish in the home. And I have 149, let me move ahead, sorry. I have 149 children from this Spanish-speaking sample that I've followed from the age of 2.5 to 12 years. For the first 2.5 to 5 years of the study, I had a monolingual comparison group that I administered the same test to in English, and so we have a comparison there. The monolingual sample was much smaller than the Spanish-speaking and bilingual sample. The rest of this slide is a response to a call in this field of research to really describe our samples. That is, from the time people started studying bilingualism, people have talked about how heterogeneous the bilingual population is. If there's no such thing as an average monolingual child, there's really no such thing as an average or typical bilingual child. So this is one stab at describing my sample. About half of the children have two parents who you would call native speakers of Spanish. The criterion I used, and I'm not offering this as any official definition of anything, but the criterion I used in constructing this particular description is if someone was born in a Spanish-speaking country and came to the United States after the age of 10 years, I said they're a first language speaker of Spanish. And about half my sample, both their parents met that criterion. Then there's another small bit where the mother meets that criterion, but she married an American. There are almost no instances of the other marital pattern. So I can't say anything about children whose fathers are the Spanish speakers and mothers are American. And then this other group includes, it's primarily both parents were born in a Spanish-speaking country, but they came to the United States at a younger age, and so they have more English and perhaps less Spanish. That's also relevant. Okay. One more thing about this sample, and this is a fairly representative sample of Spanish speakers in South Florida, but it is not typical of immigrants worldwide. It is not typical of Spanish-speaking immigrants in the United States, and it's not typical of immigrants other places. These immigrants, for reasons that I don't have time or the expertise to discuss, were educated and affluent before they came to the United States. So the monolingual sample is significantly more educated than the bilingual sample, but more than half of the parents in the Spanish-speaking homes also have college degrees. And now here's an interesting thing about them that is important to remember for later in this talk. If you just ask the Spanish-speaking parents to report their highest level of education, you get college degree or more for 58%. But about half of those college degrees were earned in the United States after immigration, and half of them were earned before they immigrated. So the difference is whether they are college educated in Spanish or college educated in English. And just hang on to that because it's going to matter later. Okay, so here's what we did. For all of these children, we visited them mostly in their homes. A few people didn't want us in their homes, and so they came to the lab. But we sat down and admitted, and when I say we, I don't mean me at all. It's all done by fully bilingual researchers in whichever language the parents preferred. We gave them an extensive interview about who lives in the home, what languages they speak, how much each language is used. We video recorded the mothers and children playing with toys and reading books that we gave them, and we administered multiple standardized tests. It was over the course of 4 visits for the bilingual children. To do everything just in English with the monolingual children was 2 visits typically. From 2.5 to 5, we did this every 6 months. After 5, with the bilingual children, we went once a year, and we have annual assessments. The measures that I'm going to be talking about are measures of how much the children heard English and Spanish in the home. And the question that we asked them was, how much of the speech addressed to your child? So we're not talking about, the parents and grandparents speaking Spanish in the background. We're talking about how much of the speech addressed to the child is in English and in Spanish. We had a language diary, so some of the mothers, the more dedicated ones, actually carried around a diary for 7 days, and every half hour wrote down who was talking to the child, what the child was doing, and what language they were using, and some of the data that I will present comes from that. And I told you we have these video recordings of mother-child. It was, I say caregiver, but it was 99% mothers. Every once in a while there would be a grandmother, or once we pulled in an older sib just to get the data. And we had many examiner-administered standardized tests of the children's English and Spanish. I'm not going to talk about everything in this study today. I'm going to focus on measures of vocabulary. We have measures of expressive vocabulary, that is what the child can say. Here's a picture, what's that called? That's what we call expressive vocabulary. We have that from 2.5 through 12. The standardized tests available to me for vocabulary comprehension were really only administrable starting at the age of 4. They were just too hard for younger kids. There is another measure of receptive language, give the child instructions and see if the child can follow the instructions, and I'll be reporting on that a little bit at the younger ages. Okay, so the results are really a story in 2 chapters. The first chapter is the 2.5 to 5 data, which these children are now in high school. So we've had some time to analyze these data. And then chapter 2 is the data from 5 to 12, where I just have the bilingual children, and that is very much a work in progress. And I'm interested to hear your feedback. Okay, so first chapter. Start with describing the language environment in the home. So this is a picture of what proportion of the speech addressed to the child is in English versus Spanish. We allowed there to be 5% of a third language. There were some indigenous languages spoken a little bit in the home, but if it was more than 5%, they didn't get to be in the study. And so what you can see here is, on average, there's huge variability in the homes, but on average, these children heard more Spanish than English at home. But that ratio changed a little bit as the kids got older, and it always moved towards using English more than Spanish. So now the next question is, what does their English and Spanish development look like? And here is the result from putting all of the children, monolingual and bilingual, children from monolingual and bilingual homes, into the same model, and this is the result of modeling the consequences of 100% exposure to English, that's the top dotted line for monolinguals, compared to 50% exposure for English. And so here's the first way in which bilingual development is different from monolingual development in its very early stages. There is a lag. If the child is acquiring 2 languages at the same time, and his language experience is divided between 2 languages, then the rate of vocabulary development is also divided between 2 languages. If you sum the vocabulary in English and the vocabulary in Spanish at this early age, it's almost identical. The limitations of the instruments have something to do with that. But basically you can say the bilingual children are acquiring vocabulary at the same rate as monolingual children, but they're dividing their efforts and their accomplishments across 2 languages, and so they have less in each language. And that was sort of the first finding from this study. These are typically developing children. We know now they're all turning out fine, but it is completely normal to take longer to acquire a language initially. If you are acquiring 2 languages at the same time. That shouldn't be surprising or controversial, but in some quarters it is. Okay. Now, it's important to point out that this is the modeled English and Spanish development from these same children. The point of this slide is to show you that these kids who are lagging monolingual children in the rate at which they are acquiring English, it's not that they are doing so fabulously in Spanish and I'm just measuring their weaker language. These children are English dominant. In fact, that's another question. They're far more English dominant than their home language experience is. And we'll try to explain that before we're done today. So here are the 2 things to explain: the lag and the English dominance in children with balanced English and Spanish input at home. So, first part of the explanation. We know that differences in quantity don't completely explain the lag. That is, the children are English dominant even though their experience is relatively balanced. But within English and also within Spanish, children who hear more English are acquiring more English, and children who hear more Spanish are acquiring more Spanish. That is, the quantity of children's exposure to each language is a very strong predictor of their knowledge of each language at any particular point in time, and it's a strong predictor of their rate of growth at this age, in this age period between 2.5 to 5. They are primarily at home. Some of them go to some childcare. It makes remarkably little difference whether they go to childcare or not to their language development, because we have looked at that. Okay, the other thing to notice in this slide is that the increase in English vocabulary that goes along with each increase in amount of exposure to English is not linear. That is, the space between these lines is getting bigger as you go up towards more English. And I would argue the explanation for that is in another fact about the homes that use different amounts of English. The children who hear the most English hear it from 2 native speakers. Okay, the monolingual homes, both parents are native speakers of English. In the other homes, some of the parents are native speakers of English and some are not. And the probability that you have a native English-speaking parent goes up as the amount of English you hear goes up. It makes perfect sense if you think the more proficient the family is in English, the more they're going to use English, okay? But the significance of that for trying to figure out the story that I'm trying to figure out is that quantity and quality travel together, okay? We know from research in monolingual development, both matter. That is, children who hear more speech at home acquire language faster, but it's not just how much speech they hear, it's the quality of that speech. And you can talk about lots of different properties that add up to quality, and I'll refer to some in a little bit. Okay, so here's the source of the quality difference that I was talking about. On average, and this is an interesting fact about the language experience of children in immigrant families, when they hear the language of the host country, often they are hearing it from people who are not native speakers of that language. And furthermore, many of their sources of input are not only not native speakers, because I don't want to say there's something, magic and unattainable about your proficiency if you're not a native speaker, but some of these parents who speak English to their children are not very proficient in English by their own account. Now you might wonder, why are they speaking English to their children if they're not very good at it, and they know they're not very good at it, and it's usually because the pediatrician told them to. But that's another story that we can talk about in question time. Okay. Here's the evidence that the proficiency of the children's sources of language exposure matter. So remember I told you we video recorded the mothers talking to their children, and we video recorded them in English and in Spanish only if they said, yes, I speak both languages to my child at home. We never said, I know you don't speak English, but I want you to try so I can record you, okay? These were mothers who said, I regularly speak both languages to my child. We recorded them speaking English, and we recorded them playing with their children one day in English, a different day in Spanish. And of course, we did the same thing with the monolingual English mothers, only in English. And we measured properties of the mother's speech. And what you see here is we divided the mothers into three groups: the mothers who were native speakers of English, the mothers who were not native speakers of English but said their proficiency was pretty good, and the mothers who were not native speakers and said, I don't speak Spanish very well. My proficiency, limitado is the word in our questionnaire. Okay, well, they were right about limitado, because if you measure how long their utterances are, and this is talking to their own 2.5-year-old child, the adult's proficiency in English is related to the vocabulary and the grammar that they use in talking to a 2.5-year-old. So you might have heard that we all simplify our speech when we're talking to little children, and you might reasonably think, how good do you have to be at a language to know more than a 2.5-year-old? But the fact of the matter is that your proficiency in a language makes a difference to the model that you provide, even within all the constraints of talking to a 2.5-year-old. And these measures of mother's speech, that is, how long the utterances are, which is really a proxy for grammatical complexity. So the grammatical complexity of your utterances and the variety of vocabulary items that you use in talking to your children is related to your proficiency in that language. So there are consequences, even for speech to a 2.5-year-old, of having limited proficiency in a language. So needless to say, I have said in many places, I don't think that pediatricians' advice that you must speak English to your child because you live in America now is not good advice. Because, and I don't have this slide in this talk, because they are giving their children English that's not very useful at the expense of giving them Spanish that would be more useful. Okay. Here's another piece of evidence that is related to my argument that proficiency matters for child-directed speech, which in turn matters for child language development. It's indirect evidence, but it's going to turn out to be relevant to a later part of the story. And the evidence is that maternal education predicts language development. Okay, we know that lots and lots of studies, different countries, maternal education is related to children's language development. But of course, maternal education is related to a lot of things, some of them in the home, some of them out of the home. So the question is why? What is it about your mother going to college that increases a 2.5-year-old's vocabulary? And I would argue that education is a proxy for a certain kind of proficiency. That is, proficiency doesn't just vary between native and non-native speakers. Proficiency varies among native speakers. And that proficiency translates into how you talk to your children, the quality of the speech you address to your children. And the evidence is that, and it's not just being a college-educated person. Here's the data. So maternal education level in English is related to the child's English vocabulary growth, but not to their growth in Spanish. Now, these are bilingual mothers. They speak Spanish to their children, but if they came to the United States and then got an education, a college education in English, it affects their children's English language development. And the obverse is also true. If you look at all the mothers who got a college education in Spanish, it predicts their children's Spanish vocabulary, but not their children's English. And these analyses control for the quantity of input, okay? So my explanation is it has to do with proficiency, but whether you want to believe that or not, this little factoid is going to be relevant later. So why is the children's Spanish not stronger given the same home exposure? Okay, so we're back to the first slide where we see that these children, at the same time as they lag monolingual children in English language development, their English is stronger than their Spanish, and on average they have pretty balanced input. So what's helping what's helping English and hurting Spanish? And I would argue that there's two things. One is pretty obvious. Out-of-home exposure is in English. And this is even for 2.5-year-olds who don't have a whole lot of home exposure. But we had those mothers who had those diary records and they carried them around. And what we found is these households where on average 50% of the language spoken to the child is in Spanish, once they leave the house, it's almost all English. Partly, I mean, even the parents start speaking English to their children when they are in an English setting. So some households have a rule of we only speak Spanish at home, but that rule, it doesn't apply when they're out of the home. So this won't impress you, but it's important for monolingual English speakers who live in Miami. It is very easy to think that the whole world speaks Spanish all the time, okay? Spanish is ubiquitous. There are Spanish magazines, there are Spanish radio stations, there are signs in Spanish. It was surprising to us that we take these children who have native Spanish-speaking parents, and the only place where their environment is Spanish dominant is inside the home. And if that's true in Miami, it's only more true every place else. Okay. Then there's something else besides exposure. There's also the child's own language use, or what is called output. So it's not just hearing a language that supports language acquisition, it is producing a language. And of course, there's no such thing as a monolingual child who only hears a language and never talks. You know, there's a few tracheotomy case studies, but normally, language acquisition is you acquire a language by hearing it and you also speak it. But bilingual children in bilingual environments have choices. And they make those choices much to the irritation of their parents who want them to learn Spanish. Because a really common phenomenon is the parents speak Spanish to the children and the children answer in English. Okay? And that turns out to be related to the children's expressive vocabulary. So what this is a picture of, on the left-hand side of the figure, you see the children were given the exact same vocabulary test in English and in Spanish, and they are much stronger in English. On the right-hand side, this is a different measure of language comprehension. It's not just vocabulary, and you can see that they are balanced. Don't compare expressive to receptive. It's a coincidence that the scales look the same. They're completely different tests. But what you can compare between English and Spanish is the difference between, what you can compare between expressive and receptive is the difference between English and Spanish. They are English dominant in expressive vocabulary, even as they are balanced in receptive vocabulary. And this is at the age of 2.5, when we don't have big numbers to work with here. Okay. And it is also the case, and that's the verbiage on the left-hand side of the slide, it's also the case, we ask the mothers, when you speak Spanish to your child, what language do they use to answer you? And it was like always the same, sometimes never switch. So we have like a 4-category response of how likely the child is to answer English with Spanish, which happens, but it happens much less than answering Spanish with English. And if you divide the sample, and I don't have a slide here for that, but if you divide the sample of children into those whose mothers say, no, they don't switch languages, they talk to me in whatever I address them in, and you compare those children to the children whose mothers say, they answer me in English a whole lot more than they answer me back in Spanish. It's the children whose output is greater than their input that show the biggest expressive vocabulary gains. Now, these are concurrent data, so maybe the children are switching because they're stronger in English as opposed to being stronger in English because they're switching it. So I had a brave student who did this study. At the time she did it, we only had data through 42 months, but basically, I mean, it's all done with modeling, but you can think of it as 2 kinds of speaker. Those whose output in English is greater than their input because they answer Spanish with English. And those children, and there are fewer of them, but enough to model, those children whose output is less than their input. Now, the difference, do you see the colors here? No, you don't see the colors here, so I'm going to have to go to my little pointer here. Okay, so these 2 lines are kids who say more in English than they hear. And these 2 lines are kids who, whoopsie, see, I shouldn't be allowed to have these things. Okay. And the bottom 2 lines are kids who say less in English than they hear. The difference between the solid and the dotted is their amount of input. So input matters, for sure. But you see the whole set of lines moving up for the kids who speak more English than they hear. And this is for the outcome measure of expressive vocabulary. If you do the exact same analysis for language comprehension as the outcome, output makes no difference. So you get an input effect, and that takes care of everything that's significant in the model. So the story these data tell is that input matters for both expressive and receptive vocabulary. Output matters too, and output matters significantly more for the development of expressive vocabulary than for the development of receptive vocabulary. Okay. So that's the end of the longitudinal data for the first chapter, but what I'm going to talk to you now is a picture of these children and the nature of their bilingual proficiency at the age of 5. There are 3 things to say. 1, on average, their expressive English is stronger than their expressive Spanish, but there are individual differences, and I'll show you a picture of those individual differences. And then the other thing that you can say is that the story, if you ask, what's the story of simultaneous bilingual development? It's a different story for receptive language skills than it is for expressive language skills. All right, so here's the picture of profiles at the age of 5. Every dot on this graph is a child. The placement of each dot on this graph is a function of the child's English vocabulary score and Spanish vocabulary score. This is the measure of expressive vocabulary. So you can see they're kind of all over the place, but not really. That is, the upper left-hand corner is pretty blank. What you see is, let me show you the next slide. Okay, so the kids on that line are balanced. The kids on that line are children who have equal vocabulary in English and in Spanish. The children above the line have higher Spanish vocabulary skills than English. Those are not a lot of children. The children below the line are children whose English vocabulary score is higher than their Spanish vocabulary score. Now, to say more, we did a cluster analysis on these data, and I won't go into the details, but it seemed that the best story, sorry, I forgot to tell you, there's another dimension on which children vary, on which bilingual children vary, because all speakers vary, and that is how much vocabulary you know in total. So a lot of the literature talks about bilingual, both adults and children, as differing in balance, as though that were the only difference. But of course it's not, just as though some monolinguals have bigger vocabularies than other monolinguals, there are bilinguals who know more in total than other bilinguals. So you can have a child who's quite balanced. I'm afraid of this, okay. Here's a child who's pretty balanced, but he's balanced at a pretty low level. So to say balance is the goal, because many people will say, well, I want my child to be a balanced bilingual. But what you really want is you want this child, not this child, okay? All right. So when we did cluster analysis, we identified 4 clusters, and that's just the mathematics of the procedure. This maximizes the within category similarity and the between category difference in a way that perhaps with the naked eye you can't quite do. And these are the 4 profiles. If you look at them, well, the first thing to know is English and Spanish are completely uncorrelated. That is, at this level, okay, not at 2.5, but at this level, there's no relation. You can't predict a child. It's not as though the English dominant kids are worse in Spanish and the Spanish dominant kids are worse in English. Really, it's a 0 correlation. I mean, R is 0.011. Not everybody gets to see that kind of correlation, but I managed. All right, there are 4 profiles, and what I've graphed over here is for each profile, their average English score and their average Spanish score. So the orange bars are Spanish. What looks here like a gray bar is English, and you can see that every profile is English dominant. They differ in the degree of English dominance, but there is no Spanish dominant profile. Another thing to note is there is no profile in which both languages are low. There is no evidence that one outcome of dual language exposure is that children can't figure anything out and don't acquire a language. Now, and I also think it's interesting to note that there are kind of 2 balanced profiles. So these kids are fairly balanced and these kids are fairly balanced, and the difference is in their total vocabulary. What level are they balanced at? And these 2 profiles are very English dominant, and the difference is in the strength of their English, okay? These are the monolingual children. I just put that up there for comparison purposes. Even controlling for a parent's education, the monolinguals are still ahead of the bilinguals, statistically significantly ahead of the bilinguals in English. But there aren't exact norms for this. That's another complicated story. But these kids are probably at about the 45th to 50th percentile in English. So they're not where their SES-controlled counterparts, monolingual counterparts are, but they're not suffering. They're not going to have problems in school because they don't understand the English. Okay, so I told you all of those things to note about the profiles, and now I will quickly tell you some of the characteristics that distinguish children in one profile from children in another profile. I guess I can see it better here. So the children who on the left-hand side are lower in total vocabulary differ from the children on the right-hand side who are higher in vocabulary in nonverbal IQ. I didn't give you every single measure we administered to these children, but they're higher in nonverbal IQ and in phonological memory. Phonological memory is if you have to measure one thing that predicts not only individual differences in vocabulary learning among typical children, but it's a marker for language delay, for atypical language development. Phonological memory is just our ability to remember sequences of speech sounds that we hear. And like every other human characteristic, some of us are better at it than others, and it predicts language acquisition. It predicts second language acquisition too. Okay, so this is basically language learning ability. These children differ in language learning ability, which is sometimes a forbidden thing to say, but it's true, they do, and it predicts who's going to be in the higher group versus who's going to be in the lower group. But now within the higher group, if you ask, how come some of these kids turned out to be balanced and others didn't, the children who are balanced, they have stronger Spanish skills than anybody else because it's the Spanish skills that vary more, okay? The variability in English skills is way less than the variability in Spanish skills. The children with the higher Spanish skills have two characteristics. They hear more Spanish at home, and they're more likely to have a mother who has a college degree that she earned in Spanish, okay? Down here at the lower level, the children who have stronger Spanish skills also have more Spanish exposure and some more maternal schooling in Spanish. I'm not sure it's a college degree. But so basically what you see is there's two dimensions on which kids vary. Total vocabulary is one of them, and that has to do with ability. The other is balance, and that has to do with the quantity and quality of Spanish that the children hear. So it's a lot of numbers, but it's really the summary story is pretty straightforward, and it's starting to sound like more of the same thing all the time. Okay, and this is the last bit of picture at 5. Actually, the kids were 4.5 when we snuck in this other receptive vocabulary test. And what you see is at the age of 4, in both English and Spanish, the children are on average English dominant, but the degree of dominance is greater in the expressive domain than in the receptive domain. And I haven't put lots of stars and error bars, but that is a significant difference. Okay, so now we're up to chapter 2. What happens after age 5? I have fewer analyses here, so this will start to go faster. But this is just completely a descriptive picture. At every 6 months from 2.5 to 5, and every year after that, we measured English and Spanish expressive vocabulary. So this is almost completely redundant with the first graphs that you saw. The sample is not exactly the same. And the top is the expressive vocabulary test, which is exactly the same test in English and Spanish. Okay, we gave it to them on alternate days in counterbalanced order, but it's the same pictures. Do you know this word? And what you can see is that English grows and Spanish not so much, okay? And it's the exact same test, the exact same scale. Now for receptive vocabulary, some of you may be familiar with the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. And it has a Spanish counterpart. I won't say equivalent. It's produced by the same publishers. It's completely different pictures, completely different number of pictures. The norms are different. So the way I have graphed it here is my very homemade way of, I know that the human inclination is to look at the two graphs and compare them, so I have tried to do a human factors fix. And the highest level of each graph is the 50th percentile for age 12 on each test. And so what you can see is by the age of 12 in receptive vocabulary, these bilingual children are exactly at the 50th percentile. Now again, this is a high SES sample. If they were monolingual, they would probably be above the 50th percentile. In Spanish, very different, okay? So these children in South Florida whose parents are trying to raise bilingual children, they have a balanced bilingual environment. They are not becoming balanced bilinguals on average. One thing about that profile graph that I forgot to mention is there were not equal numbers of children in those profiles. The strong English dominant profile was the most prevalent. Out of 126 kids who were in that particular sample, 14 were the high total vocabulary balanced bilinguals. So that's not something that happens automatically to every child who's exposed to languages in a nice family. It is a rare accomplishment, and those kids had mothers who were college educated in Spanish before they came to this country. Okay. This is just to show you the same sort of developmental picture for expressive and receptive vocabulary. This is a particular set of, it's the receptive one-word picture vocabulary test for those of you who may be familiar with it. But what this picture shows once more is these children are stronger in English than they are in Spanish. The difference is greater in expressive vocabulary than in receptive vocabulary. And what this graph adds to that story is the difference is getting greater over time. The English dominance is getting greater over time, and the difference, what's called the receptive expressive gap, is getting bigger over time as well. This is a picture of how the inputs to language acquisition are changing. So on the left-hand side, it's the relative percent of English and Spanish input in the home. So you saw that for 2.5 to 5 at the beginning. Now you see it going through 12, and English just goes up, okay? And then we have a comparable sort of graph for output. We asked the mothers later, okay? Initially, we asked the mothers, when you speak to your child in Spanish, do they answer in English? Then when that variable turned out to be interesting, we asked a more fine-grained question. What percent of your child's speech is in English and Spanish? It's one of the hazards of a longitudinal study is when you start to think, oh, I could do better. Should I change it now or should I not? And we made some changes. We added questions. But the ends are smaller at the younger ages because we had already run some kids by the time we added it. But anyway, that's the backstory. But what you see in this picture is, yes, English is going up in terms of output too. And all along from day one, which is at 2.5, English output is on average more than Spanish output. And you saw that before too. So basically, so far the story, the chapter 2 story from 5 to 12 is everything that was happening before is continuing to happen. Okay, I know this is a very complicated, well, it's a data-heavy graph, but let me tell you how to read it, okay? On the left-hand side, what we've graphed is the correlation, the concurrent correlation. So at every time point, we measure how much does your child hear English and how much does your child hear Spanish at home? And we measure their expressive vocabulary and we calculate a correlation, okay? From the age of 2.5 up to age 7, that correlation is significant for both English and Spanish. And that's exactly what you saw in the multi-level models going up to age 5. It stays the same. At 7, now remember, the concurrent correlation is going to reflect the acquisition of the previous period. We don't know how big a previous period, but when you measure something now, you're measuring growth up to now, okay? At 7, which is a year after kids have started formal schooling in the United States, all of a sudden, how much English they hear at home becomes irrelevant. And it stays irrelevant. So that dotted line, everything to the left of that line is statistically significant. To the right of that line, only Spanish is significant. So what we have a story of for expressive vocabulary is up until the children start formal schooling, the ratio of English to Spanish that they hear at home predicts the relative balance of English-Spanish, with English getting its boost from output and its boost from out of home. Once they start school, English at home is no longer relevant to their English language development, but Spanish is. So it's not the kind of general trend that's been talked about in the sociolinguistic literature that, once children go to school, it's the peers that are important and what happens at home is not. For kids in immigrant families, there's a division now of, yes, they're like those monolingual kids who what happens at home is no longer relevant once they go to school. But for the acquisition of the heritage language, it still happens at home. And this is in South Florida where Spanish is everywhere. So it's only going to be more extreme other places. And this is the same kind of thing, only looking at output instead of input. And the new information in this graph compared to the left-hand graph is for Spanish, output is even more important early on. And overall output, if you look on the input side, nothing is above 0.6. On the output side, quite a few of those correlations are above 0.6. So in general, output is even more important to expressive vocabulary than it is, than input is. Now, of course, output and input are strongly related. These are not unique effects of input and output. But input includes output and output includes input, but not equally, because output is a stronger predictor of expressive vocabulary, but not of receptive vocabulary. That's the story for all of these. Is basically you get the same picture, but output is not as important for receptive vocabulary. Okay, so that's the story of what simultaneous bilingual development looks like, and now I have to, and the environmental factors that shape it, but now I'm going to back up to the beginning and remind you about this sample. It's an advantaged sample. And the other thing that I didn't make a big deal about before, but that I think is very important, is these are children who are exposed to a heritage and a host language. That's a common circumstance around the world, that you have immigrant children exposed to a heritage language at home and a host language out of the home. But this host language is English, and English is a world language. English has a push behind it that other languages do not have. So you do not get the same story, for example, for immigrant bilingual children in Denmark, where I have done a little bit of work. And I know there's a woman in speech pathology at McGill, Ellen Thorderdottir, who studies immigrant families in Iceland. And it is really hard to get them to learn any Icelandic at all. So this is not a phenomenon of universal host language dominance. This is English, the status of English is confounded with its role as the host language in my sample. Okay, so that's the story. To go back to the title, how is it different or not different from the story of monolingual development? It's not different in terms of what language acquisition requires. That is, the quantity of language exposure matters, especially in the early years. I haven't talked about anything past 5 in terms of, I haven't given you the whole story past 5. The lag doesn't stay as big forever. That is, the children do more nearly approximate monolingual levels in English than they do early on. And this is consistent with research on monolingual development, that quantity of input is most important at the very beginning. Once language acquisition is on the way and children can bootstrap new knowledge with their old knowledge, then the quantity of input declines in its predictive power. and the rate of language development asymptotes. So between those two things, there is the opening for bilingual children to catch up. And they do almost catch up. Let me finish this, and then I'll get to that. So quantity of exposure matters, especially in the early years. Quality of language exposure matters, and output matters. So these are the three components of language experience. There's lots of evidence that they matter in monolingual development, and they matter in bilingual development too. But what's different is the nature of these experiences. So quantity of exposure is less, and it remains less for bilinguals, to the extent that you function in two languages. Unless you sleep less, you spend less time interacting in each of your languages, okay? Quality of exposure is often less, and it's often less for two reasons, one of which I've talked about. Your sources of English may not be very proficient in English. The other I didn't talk about, but think about what the data that I've presented to you show is that these children are reliant on their home exposure to Spanish for Spanish acquisition. They're not reading books, it's home language use. The vocabulary is limited, the range of things you talk about, the need for grammatical complexity in your communication is less in a language you only use at home for home purposes. And so these children are acquiring the Spanish that they're exposed to, but it's not the Spanish they would be exposed to if they were going to school in Spanish. And I didn't say that, but these kids are all going to school in English. Okay, and finally, the last difference in language experience for bilinguals is that they have options for output. And to the extent that they choose to speak English and not speak Spanish, and the receptive expressive gap will grow, and it is a well-documented phenomenon that one kind of adult bilingual proficiency is passive bilingualism. And I teach in South Florida. If I start my class by saying, how many of you speak English and Spanish? The most common answer is, well, I understand Spanish, but I can't speak it. Okay. I want to end with a last question. And this is a question someone asked me a long time ago when I gave a talk about some of these early data. And I didn't give a satisfactory answer to it, so it continues to bother me. So I'm going to try now, with the benefit of 10 years, to think about it and a little more data. Would it be possible? So I've told you a story where these children's bilingualism is not perfect, balanced bilingualism. That is, they're not at native speaker proficiency levels in Spanish, and they, by and large, are not balanced. And I have reasons for it in terms of their input and output. But what if they had perfect experience? What if they had equal amounts of equally high quality English and Spanish input and output? Is it possible? Is it within the capacity of the human brain to be a perfect, balanced native speaker, native-like speaker of two languages? And I think the answer is no. It's certainly possible to be fairly balanced and to have high levels of proficiency in two languages, and we probably have people in this room that would describe themselves that way, and I'm not going to quarrel with that. Balance is never perfect, okay? And balance shouldn't be thought of just as that is, language proficiency is not a single dimension. So lots of people are native speakers of English but actually give academic talks better. Native speakers of another language but give academic talks better in English. That's a common pattern in my experience. So to the extent that you hear the languages in different contexts, you're going to have different kinds of proficiency. But maybe, in your imaginary scenario, you've controlled for that too. And so now what would your bilingual speaker look like? And I think there are still, and this is not my research at all, but there are two unavoidable sources of difference between a bilingual speaker and a monolingual speaker that affects the nature of their language proficiency. One is frequency effects. Okay? There are frequency effects among monolinguals. We are faster at retrieving high-frequency words than low-frequency words in an experimental paradigm. And I had a student several years ago who actually came to Chile, and so we have data on college students in the United States who are monolingual English speakers, college students who are like these children grown up. They were in immigrant homes, but they're going to college in English. And he collected college students in Chile, and I don't know what university, I'm sorry. The the bilingual speakers said, you know, we use both languages all the time. Every week we speak both Spanish and English. And so we gave them a battery of tests of English and Spanish. And the bilingual American college students were not different from the monolingual American college students in their English proficiency, except for one measure: speed of lexical retrieval. Okay? See a word, push a button, how fast, okay? And the data on adult bilinguals says that reading speed is slower, even for highly proficient bilinguals. It's not that you don't know the word, it just takes you longer to find it in your head. So that is, and that's the same thing that is a function of frequency in monolingual speakers. So I would suspect that that's kind of unavoidable. And as long as you are using two languages, you're going to have a lower frequency of use of each language. And then the other, and I don't know how important this is on a functional level, but there are cross-linguistic influences. The English that English speakers have is different if they also speak another language. And that's, again, a whole literature that I don't contribute to and barely understand. But there are influences from one language to another if you know two. And again, that's going to be unavoidable in a bilingual. So the idea that if only these parents were doing things right, their children, and it's an idea that the parents have themselves. What should we do so my child can become a competent native-like speaker in English and in Spanish? And that ignores the fact that bilingualism is different from monolingualism. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you very much. And thanks to all the funding agencies, and this is only a subset of my many collaborators who contributed to this, although I claimed it all for myself in this talk.